HOA built 28 condos on my land. Too bad I own a demolition company. I still remember the first morning I noticed something strange. The sound of hammers. Not the light clatter of a neighbor fixing a deck, but the heavy rhythmic pounding of a full-scale construction crew. It echoed across my pasture like thunder. I stepped out of my white pickup, coffee in hand, and froze. On my land I'd owned for over a decade. There were men in orange vests, rolling out blueprints, trucks dumping gravel, and cranes stacking steel. At first I thought, maybe they're working next door, but then I saw it. My sign, private property, owned by Marissa Clay. Lying face down in the dirt, tire tracks over it. I felt heat rush to my face. Who authorized this? I shouted to the nearest foreman. He looked up, squinting. Mornin', ma'am. We're here on behalf of the Lakeside HOA Development Project. Phase 2. You must be one of the homeowners nearby. Nearby. I laughed in disbelief. I'm the owner of this entire 27 acres, I said, pointing at the ground. And you're trespassing. The man frowned, waving a clipboard. According to our paperwork, this land has been cleared for condo expansion. The HOA president herself signed off. Mrs. Linda Patterson. Linda Patterson. That name felt like vinegar on my tongue. She was the HOA president from 2 roads over. The kind of woman who believed every tree, mailbox, and mailbox color should go through her approval. We'd clashed before. She'd tried to buy part of my property years ago, and I'd refused. I stormed toward the temporary office trailer they'd set up on my land. Inside, 2 men in suits were looking over maps. Excuse me, I said, slamming the door behind me. You've made a mistake. This is private property, and I'm the owner. The taller one smiled like I was a child interrupting class. Ma'am, this parcel was approved under HOA Development Authority last quarter. You must be mistaken. I pulled my phone from my blazer and opened the county deed records. Lot 14 through 40, registered to Marissa Clay, Clay Demolition, LLC. That's me. Their smiles vanished. I could feel the pulse in my neck. Years of working in demolition had taught me to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about rubble or contracts. This was theft. The Callie drove straight to the HOA office, a beige building at the lakefront that always smelled like stale coffee and cheap perfume. Linda Patterson sat behind the desk, pearls gleaming, her manicured fingers tapping on a file. Well, if it isn't Ms. Clay, she said with that fake sweet smile. How can I help you? You can start by explaining why there are bulldozers on my property. She tilted her head. Oh, that land. You never returned our offer, dear. So the association voted to rezone it for community use. We're building affordable condos for new members. I leaned across her desk. You voted to build on land you don't own. Her tone turned icy. It's complicated, Marissa. You weren't maintaining it, and the board decided it was in the best interest of the neighborhood. I laughed, loud and sharp. You mean it's in your best interest? To expand your little empire. Careful, she warned. The HOA can file injunctions, and the county listens to us. Oh, Linda, I said, straightening my pink blazer. You clearly don't know who you're talking to. Her brow furrowed. I don't just own that land, I said quietly. I own Clay Demolition, LLC. The name seemed to rattle her. Everybody in the county knew the company. The biggest demolition contractor for 3 counties. The one responsible for clearing the old mill, the stadium rebuild, and half the lakeside redevelopment zone. You wouldn't, she started. Try me. I turned and walked out. The sound of my heels hitting the tile like gunshots. The paper. Trail by evening. I had my attorney pull every permit, rezoning order, and construction authorization tied to my property. Sure enough, the HOA had filed fake documents using an outdated map that excluded my parcel from the official county boundary, a clerical error. One Linda had clearly exploited. When I brought the documents to the county office, the clerk, a young guy named Ray, looked horrified. They filed this under community expansion, but your ownership predates the zoning map update. They never had permission. Then stop their construction, I said. He sighed. It's not that simple. We can issue a cease and desist, but they'll appeal it. That takes weeks. Fine, I said. Then I'll handle it my way. The next morning, I drove back to the site. The crews were setting up steel beams now. Fast work for people who had no right to be there. I climbed onto a pile of gravel, pulled a megaphone from my truck, and shouted, "Attention workers! This is private property. Stop construction immediately." A few men froze. Others looked toward the foreman, uncertain. Then Linda herself pulled up in a shiny SUV, sunglasses glinting. She stepped out, all smug confidence. "Marissa, don't embarrass yourself," she said. "This project is approved. Not for long," she smirked. "You can't touch this. It's an HOA matter." I walked right up to her. "You built on my land, Linda. You've got 24 hours to clear out before I clear you out myself." Her voice dripped with mockery. "And what are you going to do? Bulldoze it?" I smiled. "You just read my mind." The countdown that night, the rain started. Lightning flashed over the half-built condos, their skeleton frames glowing under temporary floodlights. I sat in my office surrounded by demolition plans, my plans. Every building had a structural weakness, every wall a breaking point. I'd done this 1,000 times for clients, but this time, it was personal. I called my crew chief, Diego. "How fast can we mobilize the rigs?" "For you?" he said. 6 hours. Perfect, but not yet. I'm giving them a chance. I typed out a notice. Official notice of unauthorized construction. Property legally owned by Clay Demolition, LLC. All equipment and structures must be removed within 24 hours, or will be subject to removal under County Demolition Authority. I printed copies and taped them across the site fence before sunrise. When I returned that afternoon, Linda was there again, with a police officer. She waved me over, smiling. "Officer, this is the woman harassing my workers." The cop looked confused as I handed him the deed. "Ma'am, she's the legal owner." Linda's smile faltered. "That can't be." The officer turned to her. "Mom, if this is true, you and your contractors could face trespassing charges." Linda's voice cracked. "You don't understand. This is HOA property." "Not anymore," I said quietly. The officer sighed, clearly not wanting to be in the middle of it. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "I recommend you halt construction until this is sorted." As he left, I looked straight into Linda's eyes. "You've got till tomorrow morning." The spark at midnight, I drove back to the site one last time. The rain had stopped. The crane stood silent under the moonlight, and the half-built condos looked like skeletons rising from my stolen soil. I ran my hand along one of the steel beams. "You were never supposed to be here," I whispered. Then I smiled. "But I know exactly how to make you disappear." As I drove away, my demolition trucks rolled out of the company lot in the distance, headlights cutting through the night. Tomorrow they'd know who really owned this land. They say demolition is the art of controlled violence. You study the bones of a building until you know exactly where pressure will make it sigh and fall. You respect structures, because when you break them, you must do it cleanly. No collateral, no surprises. That training made me precise. It also made me dangerous. After the county clerk put a temporary stop on the HOA's construction, I thought the worst of it was over. Linda Patterson would sulk and find another punchline for her next garden club meeting. But she wasn't the sulking type. She was the type to poison a well and blame the creek. When petty ambition meets an opportunity, people do worse than lie. They scheme. I spent the morning at the office, pacing between the plaster models and structural blueprints. Diego and two of my foremen stood at attention like soldiers. This wasn't the kind of fight you scolded casually. We needed a plan that would protect my land, my business, and the people who trusted us for honest demolition work. Lawyer first, I told Diego. No theatrics that put us in a hole legally. My hands brushed the logo on the back of my hard hat. Clay Demolition, bold and practical. Running a company taught me to think ahead. We didn't improvise on legal exposure. Janet arrived an hour later. Sharp as always. Hair in a no-nonsense bun. Briefcase clacking with intent. She scanned the file the county had given me, then closed her eyes for a beat, as if listening to the paper hum. They fabricated mapping records, she said, and they did it fast. Someone on the HOA knew county clerks well enough to make the paperwork look official. Linda, I asked. Linda or someone close to her. Janet said, either way, we have evidence they acted in bad faith. We'll file a civil suit for trespass, fraud, and misappropriation of community funds. We'll seek an emergency injunction to prevent any further work and a seizure of assets tied to the HOA project. My mouth shaped a smile that didn't feel very warm. Make it fast. Janet's eyes flicked to mine. This won't be instant. Injunctions are not candles you light and watch burn. But we have ownership and solid cause. We'll also petition for inspection of HOA accounts. If they diverted funds to private hands, that's criminal. That last phrase, criminal, landed heavy. I wanted Linda to squirm in court, to have her smug face fall off like rotten wallpaper. But justice was slow. Spectacle wins hearts, but paperwork wins courts. We would do both, mobilizing without malice, legally binding or not. I couldn't sit on my hands while workers hammered at my land. People were losing patience, tempers flare, and things get dangerous when tempers and construction equipment mix. I made a choice. Protect my crew's reputation, secure the site physically, and document everything for the court. Diego and I compiled a roster of all heavy equipment and personnel within a 50-mile radius. We didn't intend to use the machinery for anything questionable. We intended to be seen carrying responsibility. If the HOA hired third-party contractors who were unaware they were working on unauthorized land, I didn't want them to be endangered or later claim they were misled by my interference. My step was to secure the safety perimeter, fence the site properly, and provide certified notices that any further activity would be considered illegal. That evening, as twilight scraped the horizon, my trucks rolled onto the road in the convoy formation my company trained for. A press van idled in the rear. I'd decided the optics mattered. If someone tried a stunt, the truth would be recorded. We set up floodlights, temporary fencing 1 meter off the previously erected fence, and a safety board listing the legal owner and notices of unauthorized construction. The county liaison came by and confirmed our lawful right to protect the site. He promised to dispatch inspectors in the morning. I don't want drama, I told Diego. If they come with lawyers, let's have the lawyers speak. We'll do the human part. Make sure no one gets hurt and no one loots anything. We are the professionals here. Diego nodded. His jaw hardened. We'll hold line. The counterpunch Linda didn't simply negotiate. She escalated. She called a press conference. A flamboyant mess of flowers, banners, and elderly homeowners citing community benefit, like a Victorian prayer. Cameras rolled across the dais, and every local news station took the predictable bait, conflict sells. Affordable housing, she gabbled into a microphone. The community has been working for months to meet local needs. These condos were approved democratically. The camera caught the way she said, democratically, with a purple-lipped smile that pretended morality. News vans pointed their lenses at my trucks that afternoon, like they were expecting thugs in pink suits. Reporters knocked on my office door with polite curiosity that reeked of expectation. A producer with big rings on her fingers asked, Ms. Clay, The HOA says you're trying to stop affordable housing for the elderly and the working poor. How do you respond? I kept my reply tighter than my jacket. I don't oppose community housing. I oppose theft and fraud. Build where it's legal. Build where the community collectively owns, or where the developer has the right to build. Don't build on someone else's land and then call it community service. The clip ran repeatedly. The local affiliate used my line as the cutaway from Linda's banner shots. People pick sides for reasons that have nothing to do with facts. Some called me a greedy developer. Others called me an honest landowner. My phone pinged alternately with insults and gratitude. The vitriol had predictable hues. Late-night trolls, campaigners, bored spouses who liked to yell at their screens. But the neighbors, those who actually lived next to my property, were steady. They brought pumpkin pies, lawn chairs, and the occasional casserole. Their eyes told me what mattered. They wanted the truth. Sabotage and small men. When the county inspector arrived, Linda's contractors had taken down a section of my temporary fencing under cover of night. Someone had tried to make it look like my team was the aggressor. A manufactured scuffle with a hired man pretending to trudge away bleeding from a fake wound. The emergency room staff would later roll their eyes at the man's story. We had footage that showed he'd cut himself on a beer can, and then staged a camera-friendly collapse. The tactic was raw. Paint my crew as dangerous, even if only to a tabloid headline. I reviewed the footage and breathed, slow and methodical. The HOA's desperation was now an amateurish playbook. Manufacture a crisis, generate sympathy, delay legal outcomes. It would have worked had I not prepared. We documented everything and contrived no physical confrontation. When local law enforcement followed the paper trail, they found the man's story suspicious and the injuries inconsistent with the narrative. He walked away with a slap on the wrist and a lost reputation. Linda's next move was nastier. Someone punctured a fuel line on one of my trucks. It wasn't just sabotage. It was a message. Someone walked onto my lot at night, cut a hose, left the truck to idle and stall at dawn, where cameras could find it. The immediate effect was delay, and a dent to my company's reputation. The real intent was to cost me money and tell me I was unsafe. Diego spent the night with a flashlight and 2 security guards. We got our forensic team to collect fingerprints. Janet forwarded the evidence to the sheriff's department. "This is becoming criminal," she said. I closed my office door and breathed into my palms. I was tired in a way that wasn't about sleep at all. Tired because the fight had become a small war. Linda had chosen to turn property dispute into personal vendetta and the town into her stage. I didn't want war for war's sake, but I also didn't intend to be bullied off what was legally and morally mine. The meeting that changed everything. 2 weeks into our standoff, a group of homeowners requested a closed-door meeting. I expected them to be either Linda's choir or frightened citizens. What I found surprised me. The hall was half full of people who had quietly suffered under HOA ordinances for years. A man I'd once done a site with, a gruff carpenter named Tom, stood up and cleared his throat. "My wife got fined for a mailbox color," he said, voice rough with a kind of honest fatigue. For 2 years they made her repaint it because it didn't match a palette that nobody had approved. They say community standards, but it's about control. Another woman spoke of fines for a single pumpkin on a stoop. People nodded and shared their ridiculous stories. No one listened to them because Linda had always had the loudest voice and the neatest spreadsheets. But their resentment was real and ready. It was the kind of slow-burning coal that kills reputations more surely than any demolition charge. "Why didn't you bring this up earlier?" I asked. "Who would we tell?" Tom said, "They humiliate you if you object. They fine you, put a lien, and make you feel small." That silence was the oxygen Linda needed to survive. She'd fed on fear and thrifted dignity, away from neighbors who, in the end, wanted only to live on their own land. The realization made me angrier than the construction had. This wasn't only about condos. It was about restoring dignity. We formed a small coalition that night. A handful of neighbors, 2 carpenters, an ex-town planner who'd retired under Linda's thumb years ago, and an eager college kid with a knack for social media. We called ourselves, half in jest, the groundkeepers. Our goal was simple: document, protect, and make sure the truth of Linda's abuses saw the light. We started a community ledger. People wrote their fines, their phone calls, the dates they'd been censured. The ledger grew. The louder Linda screamed on TV, the more ledger entries appeared. We weren't the only ones with stories. Linda's empire had a scaffolding of little cruelties. Fines, arbitrary rules, quiet extortion. And if you stacked enough of them together, they became a method. The legal gambit Janet executed a legal gambit that was as elegant as it was ruthless. A 2-pronged assault. First, a civil suit for trespass and fraud. Second, a motion requesting court-appointed receivership for the HOA's financial operations, pending a forensic audit. If the court agreed, it would effectively put Linda out of power and place a neutral overseer managing funds while the audit ran. I signed my name and watched the papers fly like winter leaves into the clerk's hands. The judge, a pragmatic woman with no time for melodrama, read the filings and set a hearing date within days. It was unusually fast. Something in the evidence compelled the court to move. My ownership was iron solid, and the fabricated maps were clumsy, which raised more questions than they answered. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom held the theater of our small town. Cameras, neighbors, a few nuns in the back, and Linda at the front with her counsel, looking like someone trying to perform at the opera without having learned scales. She glared at me, cheeks flushed. Janet spoke in a voice that left no room for flourish. Crisp, concise, confident, she laid out the chain: fabricated maps, diverted funds, illicit contracts with a developer that would have enriched Linda and a few cronies if they'd managed to press the project through before the injunction. She handed the judge copies of bank transfers showing HOA funds wired to accounts tied to shell companies. The judge frowned, then looked at Linda. "Ms. Patterson," he said, "this court has reason to suspect malfeasance. I am appointing a receiver for the HOA funds and ordering an immediate forensic audit." It was a small sentence with seismic effect. Linda's expression collapsed like plaster. She sputtered, reached for words that would salvage something, but the judge had already moved on to logistics. When the court adjourned, reporters swarmed. Linda's smile shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. She lifted her head as if to retort, but the crowd noise swallowed her. Her world was shrinking, and it had nothing to do with me. It was about the collapse of a structure built on petty theft and the arrogance that misleads a person into believing they are entitled to other people's property. Preparing the last move even. With the court's order and the receiver in place, I wanted to make sure Linda couldn't attempt some last, desperate grab. The HOA still had the developer's contracts and a few pending permits that could, in a perfect storm, enable them to skirt the injunction. We had to ensure the land remained unusable for their scheme. Instead of a dramatic cinematic implosion of the structures, the kind that makes headlines for the wrong reasons, we chose surgical immobility. My crew would not destroy what could be standing as evidence. We would render the half-built condos unusable in a way that preserved the forensic footprint the court might need. Diego stood next to me as we walked the periphery at night. "We do it with bolts and braces," he suggested. "No," I said. "We padlock it to law." The plan was to secure the site with certified locks, neutralize active machinery by legal seizure motions through the receiver, document everywhere, and leave physical evidence intact. If the court ever needed to examine construction methods or the chronology of work, our restraint would help the prosecution prove intentionality. If we tore it down now, we could appear as the destroyers rather than the protectors. We also bolstered community outreach. The groundkeepers started a weekly bulletin listing the facts, the hearing dates, and ways to contact county representatives. People called council members. An investigative reporter from the regional paper requested access to the audit documents and promised to publish a deep dive. Linda's rookie PR didn't stand a chance against methodical truth. On the morning the receiver arrived, we watched him walk the site with a clipboard and a sober face. He ordered immediate cessation of all contractors and a lock on financial accounts. The contractor who had been raking gravel left in a huff, then booked flights out of state. Linda's edifice of control collapsed into a series of quiet defeats. Before the receiver left, he shook my hand. "Ms. Clay," he said, with an honesty rare among bureaucrats. "Thank you for handling this properly. We could use more people who understand both construction and law." I nodded. "We're not saviors. We're just tired of crooked shortcuts." A quiet night before the storm. That night I sat on my porch, pink blazer draped on a chair like armor set aside. The sky was a brilliant cold black. The half-built condos stood like war ghosts on the hill, waiting for either judgment or demolition. My crew parked their trucks in a line, engines turned off. Diego joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. "You could legally blow them tomorrow," he said, half a joke, half a test. Hell of a headline. I took a sip, tasted the bitter and the safe. "No," I said. "We'll let the law bring the hammer down. I want Linda's reckoning to be public, not a rumor. If she's guilty, the charges should stick because of evidence, not because we made it stick with theatrics." Diego grunted. Admiration mixed with the disappointment of a man who loves controlled chaos. He trusted me because I trusted calculation over spectacle. In the morning, the auditor would find misused funds. The town would read about it in a dozen versions. Some would call me villain, others would call me savior. I had learned long ago that you can't control how people interpret your actions. You can only control the actions themselves. As the world turned slow and resolute under the moon, I felt a calm settle. This war was not yet won. It required patience. And patience was what demolition had taught me. You clear rubble only after you know where to put the foundation. Tomorrow, the hearing would continue. The evidence would mount, and when the time came to claim the land, not only in law but in truth, I would be ready. We would not be the ones tearing down the town's heart. We would be the ones removing rot so new things could grow. Because owning land is not ownership of dirt alone. It's stewardship. It's responsibility. And when people attempt to steal that responsibility for petty power, they deserve to be dismantled by the steady, precise hand of justice. I slept poorly, but I slept with the certainty that I had done everything right. Not for revenge, but for order. Not for spectacle, but for the long, clean work of putting things back where they belonged. And I was far from finished. He knocked down. First person, Marissa Clay. Angry, precise, pink suit, demolition owner. When the judge finally signed the order, it arrived like an audible exhale, crisp, authoritative, the weight of law falling exactly where it belonged. The court had appointed a receiver, completed the forensic audit, and, most importantly, found sufficient evidence of fraudulent activity and misuse of HOA funds to justify an immediate remedy. The judge's language was dry, clinical, and merciless in its clarity. The half-built condos were on private land, constructed under a shadow of falsified permits and diverted payments. The record recommended restitution and, if necessary, removal of the unlawful improvements. That's the paragraph I'd been waiting for. Not because I craved the spectacle of power, but because I wanted an end that could stand up to investigators, to critics, to the tabloids that loved to paint me as the pink-suited villain. The demolition had to be irreproachable. It had to be legal. It had to be clean. We executed it with the same discipline we used to level condemned factories. My crew moved under the light of dawn like a well-oiled machine. Diego walked the site with a clipboard, checking off permits stamped by the court and the receiver's order, authorizing removal of the unauthorized structures. We had safety plans, traffic control, environmental mitigation, everything the county would expect. We coordinated with the county's environmental officer to ensure that the shoreline and any protected zones would remain untouched. No shortcuts, no theatrics. The first thing I did that morning was walk the perimeter with Luna at my heels. The skeletons of the condos rose against a pale sky, their exposed beams like ribs. For a moment, I stood very still and thought about how quickly structures can go from being promises to being liabilities. People invest dreams into walls and roofs. They put their faith in plans and permits. When those promises are built on lies, you don't just remove timber, you unmake a betrayal. Diego put a hand on my shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's do what's legal and necessary." The precision demolition is not an act of blind destruction. It's a choreography of physics. You analyze load paths. You identify weak planes. You control the direction of fall. You consider what's underfoot, gas lines, septic systems, water tables. Most of all, you leave no ambiguity for investigators. That meant we had cameras at every angle, third-party observers, engineers, and county inspectors on site, and we logged every bolt removed, every beam cut, every crane lift. When the first charge was placed, mechanical, not explosive, a series of controlled jacks and hydraulic pulls, the building didn't implode in a cinematic burst. It sighed. It folded along the line we had planned and collapsed into itself, like a theater set closing after the final act. Dust rolled, but the dust was contained. Water trucks sprayed the air. Silt barriers kept the shoreline clear. The machines hummed, and the crew moved with the precise economy of professionals who respect what they pull down and why. I watched from behind a chain-link barrier, my pink suit covered by a high-visibility vest. Reporters hovered, lenses trained, but I ignored them. This was about clearing a wrong, not creating a show. As the frames came down, the cameras recorded legal compliance, not chaos. By midday, the condos were a stack of lumber and metal, sorted, tagged, and set aside as evidence of the HOA's fraudulent build for the county to catalogue. When the receiver walked the site that afternoon, with a forensic accountant at his side, he nodded. "This is the best case demolition I've seen," he said, not trying to flatter. "You preserved the evidence and minimized environmental impact." I wanted to lean into that nod, like it was a cloak I could wear home. It felt good to be lawful and efficient at once. I wasn't just removing a building. I was restoring a truth. The public reckoning. The court didn't only remove the physical structures. The audit that followed was devastating for Linda Patterson. The forensic accountants traced funds, HOA dues, supposed community grants, vendor payments, into accounts controlled by shell companies. Emails surfaced where Linda had corresponded with the developer's representative, writing in clipped, eager tones about expediting approvals and less visible funding pathways. The evidence painted a portrait of someone who had weaponized bureaucracy for personal gain. Criminal charges quickly followed: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The newspapers had a field day. The same woman who had once primped in front of civic cameras now had her name on headlines that mentioned indictments. Her face, pale, thin, desperate, appeared on television segments, juxtaposed with images of the condominium skeletons we had carefully dismantled. I caught sight of her once that week, in the hallway outside the courtroom. She looked at me with an expression I'd rarely seen. Not arrogance or anger, but a small, exhausted grief. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. People love to tell stories about revenge as a bridge between victor and vanquished. In that glance, it felt less like victory and more like finality. She had chosen a path and it had chewed her up. The county required restitution plans. The HOA's bank accounts were seized. The developer's escrow returned to aggrieved homeowners. Some people had lost money to down payments or implied commitments. We worked with the county to allocate resources to help those who had been hurt mitigate losses. I insisted that the demolition company, my company, offer pro bono consulting to help affected neighbors repair yard damage or relocate salvaged materials for legal reuse. There was an irony to all of this. The community Linda claimed to protect had been the very thing she sacrificed. Once she was removed, neighbors began to talk openly about petty tyrannies they'd accepted. A groundswell grew, meetings not orchestrated by a self-appointed president, but organized by residents who wanted fairness and transparency. The groundkeepers went from a small, awkward group to a coalition that advised the county on establishing a voluntary, democratic neighborhood council. I kept being called both savior and villain. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that the land was free of theft, and the neighbors could finally decide their future without a clipboard-wielding autocrat. The aftermath. Once the last beam was hauled away and the dust settled, literally and metaphorically, the county proposed a plan. The illegal condo footprints would be returned to green space, a buffer around the shoreline would be reinforced, and a community fund would be established from the recovered HOA assets to sponsor neighborhood initiatives, tree planting, road repairs, and a small community center that would host civic meetings and kids programs. I was asked to sit on an advisory board. I agreed, under one condition: any decisions would be transparent, meeting minutes public, auditing regular, no secret ledgers, no whispered approvals. My price for involvement was accountability. The community center's opening was unceremonious in its sincerity. Neighbors came with casseroles and folding chairs, rather than bouquets and speechwriters. The man who'd been fined for a mailbox finally painted his mailbox the color he wanted, bright blue, and not a single soul scolded him. People laughed about small things, and slowly, the old resentments broke down into pragmatic conversations about what the neighborhood could be instead of what someone else wanted it to be. As for Linda, the legal process unfolded without melodrama. She pleaded to a reduced set of charges in exchange for cooperation, testimony that implicated the developer, and a quiet restitution plan. Justice, in small towns, often wears the shape of practical settlements rather than gladiatorial trials. I didn't celebrate her fall. I noted it, filed it away like a completed project. A year later, she left, sold her small house at a loss, and moved away. I heard she got an accounting job somewhere out west. The job paid less than her HOA perks had, but it offered a fresh start. I hope she learned humility. I hope she learned the human cost of pretending to protect others while pocketing their dues. But hope and consequence aren't the same thing. And I wasn't in the business of moral rehabilitation. I was in the business of making sure people couldn't steal my land again. The quiet gift. The part of the story that surprised me occurred months after the last truck left the site. I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter from a neighbor I'd barely known, the old widower who'd always sat on his porch, waving at everyone. He wrote about how, after the condos were removed, he had finally been able to sleep without the noise of heavy equipment at odd hours. He wrote about the kids playing by the shore and the way the light hit the water at sunset. He thanked me. In shy, careful handwriting, that letter mattered more than headlines. It was a direct accounting of what the work had done for real people, not for a story. I pinned it on my office wall above the phone, sometimes when the noise of other people's opinions got loud. The trolls, the pundits, the angry local radio hosts. I'd look at that note and remember why I'd done it. Not for vengeance alone, but for stewardship. Owning land meant obligations to the people who lived there. And I'd fight for those obligations as ferociously as I fought for a contract or a hard deadline.
The lasting shape. There's a certain poetry in knowing how to break things responsibly. I had learned to value control over timing, over safety, over narrative. Those lessons had kept people whole and the law satisfied. But they also taught me something softer, the importance of building something better in the cleared space. Demolition without vision leaves scars. The real skill is discerning what to remove so that something new and good can rise in its place. A year after the demolition, spring unfurled with a kind of modest joy. We planted native trees along the shoreline where concrete foundations had once tried to claim more land than they had rights to. The community center hosted its first open mic night, an odd mix of earnest poetry and crushed apple pie recipes. Kids learned to fish at designated spots. The county put up interpretive signs about the ecology of the lake. The land felt softer, more human. On the day the center opened, I stood at the back of the crowd, my pink suit slightly faded at the cuffs from work, and watched people pass in and out. A child toddled up to me with a mint green leaf clutched in her hand and offered it with the solemnity of a treasure. "For you," she said. I took the leaf and smiled, and for a moment, every hard decision and every sleepless night folded into that tiny offering. It felt like restitution in miniature, not money or headlines, but a quiet trust that the place was theirs again. Closing. People like simple arcs, the hero who destroys, the villain who falls. Real life is messy. You don't always get catharsis in a single moment. You get the slow, patient work of legal filings, of audits, of careful dismantling. You get neighbors who once kept their mouths shut finally finding words. You get a little boy who can splash in the shallows without a contractor chasing him away. I did not demolish because I loved the sound of collapsing timber. I demolished because someone tried to steal a place it wasn't theirs to take. I demolished because ownership carries stewardship, and stewardship requires defense. And I did it the way I knew how, precisely, legally, and with as little collateral damage as possible. That night, long after the machines were parked and the last of the press vans had left, I walked the shoreline with Luna. The water was still and held the colors of the sunset like a promise. I took a breath, felt the wind on my face, and let out a long exhale. Done, I said to the lake, to the town, and to myself. Luna wagged her tail, and we walked home. The end.